Hello there, this is Maria from JudgeAI, and today I'm going to explain what JudgeAI is as a technological system. First of all, JudgeAI is not a model, not a rule based engine, not an expert system. In JudgeAI, we're building a computational architecture that formalizes open ended legal concepts and makes them executable by machine, both for dispute resolution and legislation. Let us have a look at how it works. In law, key decisions depend on open textured concepts such as fairness, reasonableness, and good faith. These categories never have a fixed content. Their meaning shifts from one situation to another. It is precisely this reliance on open concepts that makes legal reasoning computationally complex. Machine learning works with statistics and it can extract the following data. For example, 90% of cases judges ruled this way. That's a fact about behavior. Pattern X appears in precedents. That's regularity. But judicial decisions are not empirical observations. They are subjective opinions of specific people based on personal beliefs, experience, cognitive errors, limited information. When ML learns from this data, it doesn't learn justice but reproduces bias and scales errors. That's why all ML systems in law become hyperformal, internally contradictory, and unjust. Therefore, ML cannot produce norms or decisions. The data has no normative structure. Here comes the question: if ML cannot learn justice, what remains? To abandon this idea of learning the system. Instead, make justice computable. This means taking open textured legal concepts and formalizing them, turning them into structures the system can process as an algorithm. This is not just a description, it's a formal logic that a machine can execute. This happens in four stages, and they must follow this order. The first stage is research. We do not ask, what do judges do, but what is the internal logic of this concept? What does reasonableness mean? What elements is it made of? How does it interact with other principles? The result is an explicit logical structure, not vague principles. The second stage is formalization. We take this logic and translate it into rules and criteria that a machine can execute. Reasonableness becomes a set of verifiable conditions. Balancing interests becomes an algorithm. Good faith becomes criteria that can be assessed. The third stage is validation. Before we run anything, we test it. We check that our formalization really captures what we intended. We test hard cases and check it against first principles. The fourth stage is application. When everything is ready, the machine simply applies the logic. It doesn't learn, it doesn't guess, it applies. What do we get as a result? Identical decisions for identical situations. Every step of reasoning is visible. It works at scale, and the outcomes are always reproducible. So, how did we actually build this system? We began with a question: which fields of knowledge already deal with similar problems? Where do we find formalizations of complex interactions between agents, interests, and uncertainty? And we found that several disciplines must be combined. Contract theory teaches us how to model obligations between parties. Decision theory shows us how to choose between alternatives under uncertainty. Game theory explains how rational agents interact. Deontic logic formalizes obligations and permissions. Non monotonic logic handles situations where new information changes previous conclusions. Default logic operates with rules like usually true except when. We took these foundations and built a new legal ontology. Now, fairness, good faith, and balancing of interests are not just words, they are computable structures the system can process. JudgeAI executes its logic through orchestration AI. The system runs the reasoning algorithm step by step, and the LLM is used only as a tool for narrow linguistic transformations. The LLM never makes decisions. It performs microtasks strictly under instruction. The logic itself produces the outcome, both in dispute resolution and in lawmaking. When we formalize justice in JudgeAI, we do not introduce any value system. There is only one normative parameter, a fixed target function, a society that prevents avoidable harm, eliminates premature mortality, and maintains long term systemic stability. This parameter is universal because it follows directly from the biological properties of the human organism and the objective conditions required for human survival. Everything that follows is determined by scientific data, physiology, physics, risk dynamics, and cultural dependencies. Given a fixed target and fixed objective constraints, the regulatory logic is derived strictly deductively. In this framework, justice is not a value judgment, but a necessary consequence. The target function, together with the scientific ontology, defines the only possible space of just regulation. We cannot disclose specific technical implementations due to intellectual property protection. However, we invite you to review our approach to using LLMs for constructing formal legal logic. Full details are available in the article accessible via the QR code. The same architecture applies to legislation. We can model alternative regulatory scenarios, evaluate the consequences of each provision, and produce a final regulatory version grounded in logic rather than human intuition. For example, France. France applies a blanket ban on wearing the hijab in public schools, a rule driven by ideology, not risk. JudgeAI legislation takes the opposite approach, wherein religious symbols is permitted by default, with restrictions allowed only for identification or specific safety procedures. It delivers targeted risk driven regulation instead of broad prohibitions. One more example from Italy. In Italy, the law imposes a total criminal ban on surrogacy. This forces families into unregulated environments with no medical standards or protection for women. JudgeAI legislation produces a completely different model. Surrogacy is allowed but tightly controlled with age limits, medical suitability, insurance, licensed clinics, and mandatory oversight. It replaces a harmful blanket ban with a safe, risk based regulatory framework. You can find all the tested cases under the link in this QR code. In comparison to bare ChatGPT, JudgeAI delivers a fundamentally different outcome. Instead of producing probabilistic text responses, it generates fully structured judicial decisions grounded in explicit legal algorithms, causal modeling, and reproducible reasoning. Let me give you a few examples. In a real pandemic, governments tend to avoid tough trade offs. The GPT style framework reflects this. It talks about balance, inclusiveness, equal attention to all groups, and avoiding irreversible harm, but it never makes a real decision. It avoids choosing between short term survival and long term protection. JudgeAI legislation does the opposite. It explicitly recognizes that short term sacrifices may be necessary to prevent far greater harm over the full duration of a pandemic. It allows reallocating resources toward vaccines when projections show that long term mortality would otherwise be significantly higher. This is a clear example where JudgeAI legislation delivers an actionable, risk optimized rule while human style regulation remains indecisive. One more example. In extreme scarcity, GPT style regulation insists on strict equality, equal access, no discrimination, equal shares for everyone. But in this scenario, equal distribution leads to a 100% fatality outcome. The entire group dies. Judge AI legislation takes a fundamentally different approach. When equal sharing makes survival physically impossible, it activates an emergency priority regime. What is allocated to maximize the number of lives saved and to preserve the group's survival capacity. Once the crisis ends, full equality is restored. Here, JudgeAI legislation solves a scenario where traditional equality based regulations completely fails. JudgeAI logic is applied in dispute resolution as well. We model the parties' behaviors, extract and analyze the facts, apply the logic of open ended legal concepts, and produce a deterministic decision. Legislation and adjudication are two models of the same architecture. You can test our dispute resolution prototype on the portal. JudgeAI has demonstrated 96% alignment with real judicial decisions analyzed across different categories of disputes. You can find more testing reports on the QR code. Thank you so much for your attention, and we are always happy to answer your question.